All right, guys. So now we're going to basically just walk through high yield management corn. So for some of those that haven't worked with us in the past, what we've been doing for the last basically 7 years is comparing tissue data, soil data, and then tying it to a yield level. So in other words, if we took tissue tests throughout the season, and from this particular location right here on the floor, and this particular location ended up at 120 bushel, all that data would go into a 120 bushel bucket, okay? If I was pulling from over there and it made 300, that data would go into a 300 bushel bucket. So I'm just gonna show slides of things that we've learned over the last couple years on nutritional values, when they're important to the crop to maximize yield. All right, I'd like to start this off just simply reminding us that you know, there's guys that have been kicking our butts in yields for years. They did it with very little technology, right? So Herman Warsaw, back in '75 to pull 338, and then a 15-year average of 274. You know, it's extremely impressive. And then you've got Francis Childs that have done the 442 in 2002. I know Kurt had talked about Kelly Garrett. He created a TV show called Chasing Francis. We happen to be part of that, where he was just trying to beat that 442. You know, this is basically 20 years later, and nobody's done it, right? What I like to think about is think of all the things that have changed since Francis Childs and Herman Warsaw. The planter technology, the equipment, the genetics, you know, the variable rate scripts, the things that we've gained on nutrient side of things, and then just Google, right? Just Google. Be able to ask a question is pretty cool. You know, when you go back and pay attention to what some of the tricks that he talked about, Francis Childs, he talked about putting that Coke can on the back of the planter, right? If that Coke can fell off, he knew he was going too fast and wasn't doing a good job planting. Think of where we're at today. You know, we don't have to have a Coke can, and we can do a pretty good job of understanding where our planter and how well it's doing. So again, it's impressive that they did this so many years ago, but it's also embarrassing considering what we have today, and that we can't compete or beat that. So we created a sampling protocol, and again, the reason why we do this is so we can chart out or identify strengths and weaknesses of a field. So what we typically do is we'll go in there and pull 6 tissue and 2 soil tests throughout the season. And year one, typically people aren't making a lot of changes during the growing season. Year one, they're typically just benchmarking their soil, okay? And what I mean by benchmarking, they can benchmark, you know, yield levels within their own operation to one another. They can benchmark their yield levels in comparison to every grower in that region that's involved in the program, or benchmark it versus our high yield guys. So our high yield group is anything over 300 bushel. You can actually benchmark your tissue, your soil versus their yields. And I want to start off first. This is something, again, I doubt many people are thinking about, but it's the most important critical factor of yield, which is energy. If that crop doesn't have enough energy, you'll never maximize its genetic potential. You know, I had a group that we were visiting about with manure, and I'll use this example, but if I was ultra wealthy, I would go buy a good piece of land that drained well. I'd put a hog barn up, and for the first 10 years, my yields would just keep going up, right? That manure source to that virgin ground, I'd create additional bushels because of the nutrition that I'm putting in that soil. So basically get up to year 10, you level out, and then you start to go down the other side. We work with a lot of Hutterite colonies, which have a lot of manure in their system. And the common theme is people says, what happened to my manure? Why is my manure not doing what it did 10 years ago? They'll think that it's antibiotics that they're feeding. They'll have every excuse in the book. But in reality, what it's telling you is that nutrition doesn't drive all the yield, right? Energy is. And energy, again, comes back to how much biological activity we have, how much exertion it takes for that plant to bring that nutrition up. If I've got a relay team of bacteria and fungi feeding this root something, the exact form that I wanted in, it took that plant less energy than it building a root structure to go after, okay? Or to break it down and bring it in. So energy is a huge component of total yield. And what happens in that manure system is, eventually what ends up happening is you have so much organic N that organic N is converting into inorganic N in inopportune times of the year. So in other words, in the fall, in the winter, in the spring, when there's no growing crop, we just keep accumulating nitrates. When we accumulate nitrate, what it actually does is releases and loses our carbon as CO2. So again, that's part of the energy equation. But I just want to make sure everyone understands energy and nutrition have to go up together. What we do as managers, whether you're an agronomist or a grower, is you're just trying to maximize the energy by good nutrition and good watering. That's all you're doing 100% of the time. All we're doing is trying to maximize 100% of that day's sunlight, which we're not very effective at. We're about 30 to 50% effective at bringing in sunlight and making use of it as a plant. So again, that's the basis of everything we're going to talk about, and I'm going to share nutrient levels that I think are important at each critical stage. So what this is here is just showing you our average yielding growers versus our high yielding growers within our program. And this particular slide, what I'm doing is showing you at different stages. I've got V6, V12, and R6, and then I'm showing nitrogen and potassium. So you can see that the higher yielding grower consistently has more nutrition all the way through the season. It starts stronger and it ends stronger, okay? All these slides, what I really want you to pay attention to though, is the fact that the early samples are very, very important, and then the late samples are very, very important. But when we do weekly tissue testing, what we find is through these rapid vegetative growth stages and through the early, up to roughly VT, there's not a lot of difference between great yielding corn and good yielding corn. There's quite a little difference between poor yielding corn and great yielding corn, but very little difference between good and great. Where the good and great stands out is the first 5 weeks of a corn crop and the last 5 weeks of that corn crop, okay? That's when the great yields show up. All of us can walk a cornfield and understand, you know, at basically V7, V8, if we've got a good potential, right? You can pick a good field from a bad field at V8. You can look at nutritional levels, you can look at just the overall appearance of that crop, and look at stalk circumference, etc., and understand if you've got a good or a poor crop. But where the great crop comes in is that back half. I don't know if I'm doing something.
We're messing with it, trying to get the show there.
Oh, tough to see?
Yeah, keep going.
So anyway, and that's why I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the reproductive stages. I believe that all of our fertility plans are basically designed before we plant. We might have some things that we do in season, but primarily it's nitrogen and sulfur, which I would debate that nitrogen and sulfur are our least likely responses. And a lot of these really high productive soils, where we're getting our biggest bang for our buck is actually in other nutrients. It's our micros, it's our potassium, it's our calcium late in the year. When guys say, I've tried Y drops for 3 years and I haven't gotten anything out of it, I would say that those guys are typically heavy end users with their Y drops. It's the combination of nutrients and how they work together to create a nutrient dense plant that actually creates the yield. It's not one nutrient. So I talked about, again, influencing that plant, and we have to make sure that we influence it late. So the only way we influence any plant late is if we influence it at birth, okay? At birth, all we're doing is basically creating the structure that we think is needed to have the vascular system to be able to bring up enough nutrition at the end of the year, again, that last 5 to 6 weeks of that year, because that's where that yield is made. So again, the early side and the late side, the early side, all we're doing is looking at nutrients that are really going to affect the total sunlight that I'm capturing, because basically if we don't capture enough sunlight earlier, we don't put any fat in the system. And what I mean by fat in the system is, if the more exudates that we or the better sunlight capture we have, the more exudates that plant's going to form, okay? The more exudates that a plant forms, it's basically putting food source so that it can later use it to feed that bacteria and fungi, because they're going to feed that plant at the end of the year. If you can't keep up, what ends up happening is the plant goes and redirects all of its sugar. So instead of, so I'll give you an example. If I'm a corn plant, in the morning, I'm going to start capturing sunlight. By roughly 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, I'm going to start taking that sunlight energy that I had, and I created sugars with it, sucrose, okay? As I created that sucrose, at the end of the night, I'm going to drop that out into my root system. 50 to 70% of it, depending on the stage of the crop. So 50 to 70% of all the sugar that I made, which sugar's money, that's the only thing we're making out. I mean, the more sucrose you can put in a plant, the more money you're going to make. The healthier the plant is, the more yield you have, the more yield potential because of the energy. Okay, so at the end of the day, I'm dropping them sugars into the soil. The plant wouldn't do that unless they needed it, right? They're dropping in the soil because they know that association is important. They know if they don't feed their friends, the friends don't feed them. So it's a big part of it. Build fat in the system, so you got to maximize sunlight at the beginning, so at the end of the year you have that functioning system. So here's calcium, phosphorus, sulfur. If it's hard to read, again, basically the key points are here is at V6 you're going to notice a difference between good and great corn. And then at R5, you're going to have a big difference as well. Again, on this particular slide, what really stands out to me is the calcium at R5, 158% greater at the average yield of 312 than it is at the average yield of 230. So a huge increase in total calcium uptake for the guy that has that big healthy, girthy stalk at the end of the year. And typically you can see if you've got calcium deficiency before you send it to the lab. If you've got a lot of, what you really want to see is that round stalk structure. When you start to see the flats, now I understand genetics has an influence on this as well, but the flatter that stem is typically is a great sign that you're short on calcium. The more girthy and round or sphere, you know, the actual shape of it is going to tell you if you have enough calcium. And again, that calcium is huge for the structure because late in the year you need that xylem and phloem activity and you need a good plumbing system to do it. We'll talk more about cytos and auxins when we get into the beans because it's easier to explain, but just keep in mind that everything we feed the plant is going to affect its energy, but it's also going to affect its mood, okay? And having a good mood is important, right? Ask your wife. But the cytos and the auxins are the hormones that are going to control that, okay? So you've got ethylene as well. Everybody's heard of ethylene, right? That's part of the reason why we apply a fungicide, and a fungicide has a plant health label. The reason the plant health part of it is because it's shutting down ethylene production, right? It's slowing ethylene production. Ethylene production is the hormone that tells the plant, hey, I'm in trouble, I'm stressed, you know, help me, okay? I'm explaining this to you because it's important, because if you look at a tissue test and your nutritional levels are lower than you want, and you went out and added, let's just say you're short on nitrogen, so you go add nitrogen. That plant won't take that nitrogen into it and actually go higher in N unless it releases ethylene, it drops ethylene. Because if it doesn't drop ethylene, what happens is it holds its sugars in. So in the morning when it said it should be empty of sugars, because after a night it's releasing them into the soil, it's still full of sugar, okay? That sugar has to release, otherwise it can't bring nutrition back in. Does that make sense, guys? So again, that stress part's important because if that plant's under stress and you feed it, you actually go backwards in yield because you added a foreign material to it that it can't break down and it's just more stress. So always feeding a plant just because you're short isn't a good thing. In fact, you probably you've seen it on your own farm. You applied something and you went backwards, it didn't go forward, right? Why it went backwards is because that plant was already under stress and you applied it more likely. So how you can identify that again is the sugar load from, let's just call it 10 a.m. versus the sugar load at 7 p.m. There should be a gigantic difference in those two, okay? I don't know why it keeps doing that. Oh, then I got a little carried away. All right, another thing that I want to point out is, and this is just something we started paying attention to 2 years ago, but it'll be on the report going forward, but this is just looking at your cations versus your anions. So again, cations being, you know, you can have cation as part of your nitrogen source because if it goes in as ammonium, that's a cation, right? Nitrate is an anion. Okay, well, potassium's a cation. Magnesium's a cation. Potassium, magnesium, and calcium are all cations. So what I'm doing in this slide is comparing the cations to the anions and just showing you how important that is to that overall yield. And the other thing I'm showing you here is total nutrient density of that crop. Goes back to higher yield as well, and probably healthier food. But what I'm showing you here is that the high yield is the orange, the average yield is the blue. So that first box is showing you total nutrition. It says 8.32. What that is adding up all the nutrition in that plant. So if I got 3% nitrogen, you know, 0.4% phosphorus, 2% potassium, 0.5 calcium, it's just adding that up. And a high yielding crop at V6 is 10.09 nutrition versus 8.32, so roughly 20%, right? Greater nutrition already in the plant. The other thing that's interesting there is when I take cations and I divide it by anions, you'll see I'm actually cation dominant. I've got 1.02 more cations or times in comparison to my anions. Cations are what builds structure, what builds plant health. Anions are what are going to build growth. Okay, so if you want to put a flower and make it grow tall, what do? You put a lot of nitrogen in it. Nitrogen's an anion, right? That's what's going to stimulate above ground growth. But cations are going to build the structure in the plant health. So keeping those balanced are important. By the time we get to R5, again, I told you a lot that there's a heck of a difference. But look at the total nutrition at R5. I'm at 3.99 on 240 bushel corn roughly, and I'm at 6.68 on my healthy high yielding corn. So I've got just about, whatever that is, 40% more, 50% more nutrition in the plant, right? Same thing with my cations. You can see there's 0.86 versus a 0.67 ratio. I keep talking about that because you can't get nutrient density unless you keep cations in the plant. As soon as the cations start getting dominated by your anions, you'll never keep back up, and you'll never have a nutrient dense crop. All you're going to have to do is a watery crop that grew really fast. Does that make sense to you guys? You have to keep the nutrient density. And the only way you keep nutrient density is the cations move up as the anions move up. Once you dominate your cations with your anions, you're in deep trouble, and I don't think you'll ever catch back up. Now, think about that, and how does that affect the way we manage? Well, what do we do at the beginning of the year? Put all of our nitrogen and all of our sulfur out. Some of us do, right? Well, that's a lot of pounds of anion that's going to outcompete that cation. So if you want to give your chance, actually, even a shot at it, you've got to back off some of these anions unless you've got just very good soils that can release cations at a high level. Because when we're force feeding anions at 200, 250 pounds and we apply 30 or 40 or 50 pounds of cations, it's just hard for that plant to have equal parts per million of both. And it's important. As you watch your own tissue for a year, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But again, late season plant health, you can almost tell it when you're walking the field if you're anion dominant or not. And the other thing I'll mention is if you are anion dominant and it's nitrate that's doing it, typically you're going to have way more disease and typically you're going to have more insect pressure. What you want to have is a complete protein in the plant. And let me explain that. So a complete protein, so a corn plant, here I am, I take up nitrate. What do I got to do after I take up nitrate? Is nitrate good for the plant? It's not, because if you think about it, nitrate, let's just say you're in South Dakota, drought stress world, and you have to feed corn that didn't put grain on it, okay? We actually can at times because it's toxic, because it's high in nitrate. The nitrate kills the animals. Well, the reason it's high in nitrate is because the ethylene came up in the plant, and it wouldn't allow that plant to do its job, which is to convert nitrate to a protein. What you want to have in a nutrient-dense plant is all proteins. You actually don't want the anion itself of nitrate, but it's got to go in as nitrate or ammonium. So it's going in as a nitrate, it converts to ammonium, and then it converts to a protein, okay? Well, that process itself takes 30 to 40% of that total daily sunlight. So again, we talk about being energy dependent, right? And we only get as high a yield as the plant has energy. If we force feed nitrate through the entire system, we'll never have that. We can't maximize the energy because we burn so much of that energy up just in that conversion process. So what we typically want guys to do is start heavy on ammonium and end heavy on ammonium. Again, ammonium's positive, it's stable, and when it goes in the plant, it takes one less process to convert to a protein. This year I just thought was interesting because I think it puts an emphasis on energy again. But here what I did is just took the leaves, the ear leaf off, okay, of these plants. And I did this late in the year, R3, and then I weighed them at harvest. And basically taking the ear leaf off at R3, which is pretty late in the game, I only lost 5.2 bushel. Here I took the entire top half of the plant off, right? So everything from the ear up. And when I take that off, 128 bushel versus 200 bushels, okay? So a huge effect on any leaf above the ear. Here I took the bottom ones off. So in other words, I took everything from the ear leaf down off, and I have a 169.6 versus 200. The reason that's important, I guess, or what I'm trying to show by that is what happens when you have a late season nutrient deficiency. It's going to show up in the bottom half of the plant, right? Typically, you're going to see your N, your K, everything's going to burn up in the bottom half of the plant. So what happens is that plant's remobilizing nutrition from the bottom to the ear. That's what it's doing. That's its job. It wants to take all of its energy and put it there. Why I think this is interesting and why I think it's a great opportunity to learn is because we had double the yield loss when we took the above ground. Nutrients aren't coming down like they're going up. Okay, they're not. There's less mobilization from the top going down. So what's actually driving that yield loss was the fact that we lost that much sunlight potential, that capture of that sunlight. So again, to me, this is telling me that late in the year, sun's more important than nutrition. We already know nutrition is important, right? We have every university in the world tell us that it's important, but they don't talk about the sun. When you take that away, the biggest yield loss is energy, and it always is, and it always will be in every yield, in every crop that we provide. This here is just showing you the difference in pushing ammonium late. If you look at that stalk, you see how I got yellowing in that stalk versus white, beautiful pith. That's what we're after, obviously, is the white. But all I did here is threw out some 8009, which is just liquefied AMS. Put very little on, 14 gallons. So as far as plant food, you know, you're talking nothing almost. And I had, whatever that is, 34 bushel gain, right? Just by that one application. And why I think that is because I let that plant take up ammonium rather than forcing it to take up nitrate. And I kept the sulfur in there too. And again, that's important. I think I've got some slides on that coming up, but the sulfur is important because what we talked about earlier, we need nitrate. We don't need nitrogen in the plant as nitrate, we want it as a protein. Well, everything wants to be a protein. So in other words, what helps that is sulfur, moly, and nickel. Those nutrients are all going to help that plant convert the nitrate to a protein. I'll give you an example of that. I had a high yield grower call me and he says, hey, so most high yield growers, they have it in their mind, and they're pretty darn close, but they've got a number in there. At R2, R3, they want to have whatever their nitrogen level is, they take that times 100 and they think that's their yield potential. So if I'm at R4 and I want 400 bushel corn, I need 4% nitrogen, okay? Or R3, and I get 4% nitrogen, that means I can get 400 bushel corn. Well, this grower calls me and he said, I've got a 2.8 and I can't get it to go any higher. And I said, well, how much nitrogen you got there? He goes, I should have plenty. I'll take a soil test, pulls a soil test, comes back, he had 99 pounds of nitrogen sitting right below it. Well, if there's 99 pounds below it, why didn't that plant take it to a 4%, right? He wants it at 4%, 3.5 bare minimum, but he couldn't get it there. What actually the issue was is that he didn't have enough sulfur to convert it to a protein. Okay, if you don't have enough sulfur to convert it to a protein, all that's happening is that stalk is accumulating nitrate, and it can't actually bring in any more nutrition because it's just filling itself up. When that happens, that yellowing of that pith will happen. Okay, so again, he had plenty of nitrogen there, but what was happening is as it took it in, he wasn't converting it quick enough to a protein, so he couldn't bring any more in. So all we did there is added 2 ounces of moly and some sulfur, and instantly, well, not quite instantly, but about 10 days later, his nitrogen went up to a 3.4. So again, you can move the nitrogen levels, but you can't just do it with nitrate, because if it's not converting to a protein, the plant can't take it up. It's just full. And then this here is basically the slides to break that down, but sulfur, manganese, and magnesium are all important in the process of converting to a protein. They're not directly related, but they are. And the reason these are is because they're all tied back to sunlight. So magnesium, for instance, is the center to chlorophyll production. If you don't have enough magnesium in it, you can't create chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what we're after, right? Because that's going to end up being what our sucrose is coming from. Magnesium is very, very similar. Same thing with moly and nickel. So again, a lot of people talk sulfur, moly, but the other aspect of that is the more sugars I can add to the root or put into the plant, the easier it is to convert to a protein as well. And then, like everything, balance is truly everything in a plant. You know, if you get excess P, what happens? You limit zinc. You get too much zinc. I had a grower that he went to a high yield meeting and they came back and said the zinc levels are too low, so he goes out and puts 2 gallons out of zinc, and he ends up getting beat by 17 or 18 bushel. Ended up being, when we look back at his tissue, it just didn't have any P in the plant because he had so much zinc. So everything's a balance. It doesn't matter what the nutrient is. Just keep in your mind, as I add one, you have to look at something else because it's a pendulum that you're balancing. So again, if we're only adding nitrate in our Y drop, it's pretty easy to see why we don't get consistent yields from it, right? Because it could be forcing out K or calcium at the end of the year when we really want K and calcium more than we did nitrate. Outside of NPK, I think Stephen talked about genetic management or hybrids selection. I think that's extremely important. The herbicide timing is extremely important. The stress part is extremely important. Like I keep saying that I believe if there was a way to measure it, I bet 30 to 40% of our total yield comes back to how well we mitigated stress. Mitigation of stress is a big part of it, whether that's because the soil is contaminated with salts and sodium and everything else that's causing stress, or we have 10 days of cloud cover. Whatever it is, mitigating stress has got a huge impact, and I think that's the next wave of nutrition. Some of the other things just to think about as I'm thinking about corn, what we've done is we keep backing off population. It's way easier to manage 30,000 than it is 35 to 40, right? I mean, we had some 360 corn this year that was planted at 32, ended up at a 28,000 stand. The potential's there to have huge years and huge yield if we can keep the nutrition up. It's way easier to keep the nutrition up at 28,000 than it is 38,000. That's the reason you see lodging. It's way easier to keep direct sunlight or energy up at lower pops as well. So our rule of thumb is if you're not already maximizing 10 bushel per thousand, don't keep creeping your population up. Like if some people just thought that was the easy button. If you go back 8-9 years ago, you know, seed companies just said, hey, if you want higher yields, plant more seed. In all reality, that's not the case. Most of the guys have actually gone back in population rather than push forward. And I believe it's because, again, we can control that plant, do a better job of having even nutrition from the bottom of the plant to the top. And that's what creates yield, is even nutrition from top to bottom. Any questions on the corn side? So high yield soybeans, again, everything that I talk about, it's just because I learned it from somebody else or working with good growers that teach you along the way, right? So I might learn something in Illinois or Indiana or Ohio, might learn something in Nebraska, and all of a sudden that made what I learned in Illinois or Indiana or Ohio more important, or I understood the entire picture. I always say that all we really do as agronomists is just keep gathering puzzle pieces, and hopefully at the end of the year we can put them puzzle pieces together to tell a story. Lucky here, Jimmy's here today. He's had, obviously better yields than I've ever raised, so he can yell at me if I'm telling any lies in this next presentation. Same thing, start up with a sampling protocol because I believe, again, we need to benchmark to identify our weaknesses. But I really do want to talk more about the hormone production here because I believe that if you don't understand the hormones in soybeans, you're probably only going to get to 100 if you do it on accident. So auxins. Auxins are, I'm just going to talk about the two dominants, ethylene in there being the third, but the two dominants are auxins and cytos, okay? Auxins are developed anytime that plant has above ground growth. So any shoot tip growth, what happens is that plant's producing more hormones. The hormone that it's producing is auxins, okay? Anytime that the auxins produced, what it's going to do at the end of the day is move down with your sugar, down in the plant and the sugar go to your roots. When it goes to your roots, root shoot tip growth begins, okay? You can't have root growth without auxins because they're taking the sugars down with it. They're like a magnet to the sugars. Once the shoot tip growth happens, it creates cytos, okay? And the cytos are trying to get up that plant, and that's what's creating branching, okay? So auxin growth is vertical growth. Cyto growth is that short, kind of squatty plant, right? And in reality, squatty plants are much more efficient for multiple reasons, but one simple thing you can do to look if you're cytodominant or auxin dominant when you're walking in a field is just look at how much elongation there is between each node. If you're out there and you're walking through the field and you've got more than a thumb between each node, typically, we're trying to keep half to 3/4 inch, the absolute widest between each node in a soybean plant, because that's where we maximize the most nodes per acre and the most energy efficient plant as well. So again, they all work together. If you get auxin dominant, what ends up happening is the cytos can't get up the plant because they basically fight with each other. Now, ethylene, we talked about it a tiny bit on corn, but the same thing happens here on soybeans. As soon as ethylene is produced at a high level, what it does is shuts the cytos and the auxins down. So let's think about this, which say we go through stress, we're trying to create, this big, basically bushy plant, right? And all of a sudden, we go through stress. What you'll see is these laterals that will come out, and they'll come out about 2 inches, 3 inches on the soybean plant and stop. When they stop, it's just simply put that they didn't have enough hormones, cytos, to actually develop them, okay? So that could have stopped because A, we got auxin dominant, or B, because ethylene happened, and when ethylene happens, it shuts both of them processes down. So this might be boring to you, but it's pretty dang important to understand that everything we're doing in the plant is still tied to hormones and how if it's having a good day or a bad day, and this is driving a lot of the yield. So managing for 100 bushel beans, basically I'm just putting the nutrients that I think are important early. This is early season success. I put in there calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, cobalt, silica, and then the trace elements, zinc, boron, moly, and manganese. In the blue box, if you can't see it, what it's doing is isolating the high yield growers versus our average yield growers and what stands out at this stage. What stands out at this stage is zinc is 168% greater in the plant on high yield beans versus average. Manganese is 240% greater as far as that goes in the plant. So again, 2 micros were actually the biggest lead to understanding if you had high yields or low yields, was there's 2 micros. Now I will say there's something to that on the soil side as well, because you've got reducing state and oxidative states in your soil, which have an effect on what form of nutrients actually are available. So iron and manganese, for instance, it could be 3 positives or 2 positives, one is a double positive, and then that plant can take it up. If it's triple positive, it doesn't. So in other words, there's a little more to the story, but my point being is when I'm building a soybean plant, what I'm actually trying to do is make sure that those nutrients are my dominant nutrients as far as availability is concerned to that plant early season. And honestly, some of the best starter opportunities I've seen in the last 2-3 years is simple things. It's trying to mimic nature. It's putting a fulvic and a humic, a little bit of zinc, a little bit of moly, those type of things in my 2x2 in my in-furrow. We've had better response with that than we have that of phosphorus, potassium, any other nutrient actually. Is keeping in trace elements high and keeping an energy source there available for that crop early. So really what we're doing is we're just mimicking nature. We're trying to create a plant that thinks it's 6 weeks old at day 1, meaning we're putting what it would have done if it had captured sunlight, right? It's taking sugars and acids like we talked about, excreting them through the roots, and we're putting that there by the root the day it's planted. So then when that seedling pops out, it associates with it and we get into a head start. Does that make sense? Just trying to make that plant associate quicker with your microbes. So this is I think is an important picture. Just to understand that as you get more below ground growth than you do above ground growth, you're going to have a better opportunity to have branching. Reason being is because, again, your hormones that are developed, your cytos, are going to come from your below ground growth. So if you can get ahead of your above ground growth and below ground growth, you're going to see you at a shorter, squattier plant, and you're not going to have this big, tall, elongated thing that's going to fall down on you later. Mid-season, what we're looking for is calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. Again, we're keeping our zinc, and we're really starting to focus more on the boron at this point. Boron's important early, but it's really important late. And again, the reason boron's important is because it's a traffic cop of the nutrients within the system. So in corn, I feel like there's less value to late season boron than there is in any other crop, and that's because it's telling everything to go to the ear leaf, right? It's got one place to send everything. Where in soybeans, you've got 100 ears on that plant, or maybe 250 or 1,000 if you're Jimmy, on that plant that you're trying to direct nutrition to. So boron becomes a lot more important in a plant that's got to direct to a bunch of different sinks rather than one sink or one ear on corn. But what stands out here, high yield versus average yield, is the zinc and the boron. You're 174% greater zinc and 156% greater boron on beans that are over 100 bushel versus beans that are in the 60, 70 range. This is critically important. Greg McClure out of Illinois, Jimmy both, they've been consistently over 100. One of the things that is every single year that I've worked with them, they'll always get into reproduction quicker than anybody else, okay? Getting into reproduction is key. The faster you can do it. Most of us think that it's not going to happen until June 21st, right? June 21st is when we're told we're going to flower. We can definitely push flowering up. This is on June 16th, it's on Greg's beans, and he's already got a pod on. You know, it's insane. But nutrients that help that plant get into reproduction quicker. So again, you have a vegetative stage of plant growth and you have reproductive stages of plant growth. Nutrients that help that plant convert to a reproduction, tricks it into thinking that it should be in reproduction, is sulfur, manganese, phosphorus, and ammonium nitrogen. Okay, so them nutrients are what we're applying to force this plant in to trigger earlier reproduction growth. And I talked to you earlier about how the cytos stack in that stem. You know, this is a 3.5 inch tall plant, and it's already got 6 fully developed nodes. Again, the shorter, squattier. This being, at the end of the year, we were trying to estimate it out, you know, at basically 70,000. We felt that this bean was like a 350 bushel bean plant, okay? Well, the field made like 122. So if that's a 350 bushel bean plant, we probably had some 30, 40, 50 bushel bean plants in there as well, right? Well, what you see on the variance, I guess, from the 30 and the 40 versus the 300 type bushel bean plant is just that structure. If you didn't have the structure early, again, you missed the boat. I've never seen high population beans do as well as mid-range population, and I think it's because it's easier for that plant to control. Again, naturally what happens when you plant a bean at 50,000 versus 100,000 is you get more lateral structures, right? It's just harder to control that hormonal stimulant at 100,000 than it is at 50, 60, or 70. So late season, some things that we water, so sorry, this is mid-season. I already did that. I think I did. I must have went backwards. Another thing is we talked about this in corn as well, but again, that stalk girth or that stem size. This last year we used calipers just to measure and then to ultimately understand how that had effect on yield. You could typically pull out every 100 type bushel bean plant by V4. By V4 you knew if you had a 100 bushel bean plant or a 40 bushel bean plant, okay? And how we knew that was, the simplest way was this caliper. You can tell the difference in stem size, and it always correlates back to yield. But if you look at those plants, you know, they're pretty darn impressive, and again, how short and squatty they are is the other part of that, because it takes a lot less energy to move that nutrition, you know, this far in between nodes instead of a longer distance. I think this is interesting too. I think it comes back to the same reason why corn is easier to manage at a low population. But, and I know you guys can't see this, but basically what I did is highlighted nutrients that are immobile in the plant, red, mobile in the plant, or highly mobile in the plant, green, etc. Okay? And then what we did, and Jamie was part of this, but we took beans planted at 70,000 final stand versus 130,000 final stand. And really what we were after is, you know, what nutritional levels change between 130 and a 70, much like in corn, why is 30,000 easier to manage than 45,000? And in both scenarios, what you actually find is that if you go from top leaf to bottom leaf of a corn plant or a bean plant, the wider the range of that nutrient level, the lower the yield. Okay, so nutrient density across that entire plant is very important. Well, when I do that on these particular deals, if I go from 70,000 the top two nodes and compare the nutritional levels to the 70,000 at the bottom two nodes, and then do the same thing at 130,000, certain nutrients, especially calcium, you can see have 169% change and drop between my top and my bottom leaves at 130,000. We only have a 24% change in nutrition from the top of the plant to the bottom of the plant in lower populations. Same thing's happening with iron, for instance, 302%. You know, every nutrient across that board has greater variability at 130,000 than it did 70,000. The exact same thing holds true for corn. At 45,000 versus 30,000, there's greater variability from the bottom leaf to the top leaf. And again, we're all taught that we take the ear leaf, that's the most important leaf. We're all taught that tissue testing soybeans, you take the most fully developed trifoliate. I'm not saying that's incorrect, but I'm saying when you're really focused on yield, it's total nutrient density, because at the end of the year, what we're going to do, every plant's going to do is remobilize nutrients to where it needs to be in the plant. That's what it's forced to do, and that's why you see the leaves of the corn plant fall off at the end of the year, because once it's moved its sugars and its nutrients out of that, it's necrotic, it dies off. Beans, you don't see it as much, but beans, I think, is even more vital, because corn, it's easier to move up and down this type of a plant than it is, you know, crazy. I actually believe this, that once that node, okay, again, so soybeans, let's think about it, you get, on a main stem, you got a potential of 22 nodes typically. You might hear the guys say 23 or 4, but 22 is very standard. Laterals, for instance, if you get a good plant that laterals at, especially at the cotyledon stage or the node above the cotyledon stage, we can actually create closer to 90 nodes on a plant if you get the laterals corrected, right? And I guess the reason why that's important is because every leaf, kind of like cotton, the lead leaves are going to feed that node. So if the nutrition that's connected to this node is poor, or the energy level or the sunlight level connected to this node is poor, we'll see we'll either have a barren node, or we'll have one bean pod or two bean pods, or we'll have, you know, we'll have less total beans be produced on that node is what I'm getting at. It's not going to say, it's not like corn where you see the bottom leaves fall off. It's not going to reallocate extra nutrition down here to feed this node on a bean plant. And I think that's part of the reason why low population seems to work, is because you can get nutrition even through it, and you get more direct sunlight to every node. I also think it's another reason why I think foliar feeding pays better in soybeans than it does of that of corn too, because you're trying to make sure that you have even nutrition to feed every single node. So at the end of the year, finally we're talking about the N, P, and K. You know, this entire season I haven't cared about N, P, or K. P a little bit, but K not that much at all, and nitrogen neither. But at the end of the year, they do become important when you get into the R3, R6 stages. Those are the elements that stand out from a high yield scenario to a low yield or an average yield scenario, is just the fact that we have consistently more N, P, and K. But again, they're more, I know they're important throughout the season, but it's funny that we all focused on those three nutrients, you know, on 95% of our budget, but yet I didn't talk about them until the last 5 weeks of the year for corn or soybeans. They didn't have a big impact on total overall yield until the last 5 weeks. And ultimately, just if we can create the structure, you can just see how much more pods that we can fill and feed, because again, it's so much easier to have equilibrium within that plant. What we most of the time see as an average producer, such as myself, you'll go out there and pull 10 plants, you'll see that the middle's stacking most of your yield. You'll see the tops are more barren and the bottom's more barren. The high yield plants, again, lower population plants, it's easier to see that evenness up and down the entire plant as far as pod fill goes. And it's because of the slide I showed you with nutrition. Any questions on any of that? It's not a great sign.
James, as a rule of thumb, would you, as a primary change, would you go from 140 to 70,000?
What's that?
Would you go from, if you were planting 140,000 population beans, would you move to 70 based on your current farming practices? Or if you're pulling back to 70, do you need to do something different to make that a better management?
Yeah, good point. So the question was, would you just standardly go from a 140 to 70, right, and manage that? Jimmy's got an awesome trial on this. He took 3 Pioneer beans, 2 different varieties, right? And he went from 30 to 150, was it? Anyway, same management across all 3 beans. Now when I say management, he's trying to force lateral growth, right? I mean, he's hitting them at V2, V3, trying to promote that. What was the yield difference? Did you have one variety that had like a 35 bushel response? Or go ahead, share that with you.
Yeah, so 31 and 33, lower pop, one variety didn't like over the other one. So you got to kind of watch the variety of what you're going to plant, how the plant reacts. But I did see that as we came up in population, got closer to that 70,000, 80,000, yield leveled out. And then it went a little higher, got a little less. But down in 30,000, there was about a 20 bushel difference.
Yeah, so just the variety response from low pops, it varies a lot. The other thing I will say that makes it tough, because you still want an upright lateral. If you get them too wide, anybody that's tried it, if you get the wrong variety, what they do is they split at harvest. So you've built this beautiful structure, and at the end of the year, you don't get to gather them up very easy. So that happens too, based on genetics, but I also think a huge influence on that is silica and calcium early. You want to hit that plant again, V2, V3, and you want to create structure. Another thing I'll comment on is that's how we build our variable scripts. So if we have a tough soil, we'll plant at 140,000 in the same field, and our best soils will be down to 55, 60. We try not to ever allow a 55, 60 on our tough soils, just simply because we don't get enough main stem height. So again, what you're trying to do as a soybean producer is manage how many nodes per acre you can increase, right? So on a hilltop, for instance, my beans only are going to get this tall in South Dakota. So that tall, I'm averaging 11, 12 nodes. Well, to have any chance at high yields, I got to stack more plants, right, to get more nodes. On a high yield area, a soil that's got good carbon and good natural mineralization, what we actually see is the opposite. The more air movement, more sunlight we can get down there, so we want to drop the population, and we can create actually more nodes on 50,000 than we can create at 150,000. Because again, you're going to maximize a main stem at typically 22. So if I want to get more nodes per plant, I have to get the laterals, and laterals are easy to create at 90 and below than they are at 90 and above. Any other questions?
What does the silica do?
What's that?
What does the silica do?
Well, silica's quite a few things really, but for one, it stimulates phosphorus and potassium uptake for sure. For two, it strengthens cell walls, so your pectin on the outside of the cell walls is stiffer. Like you can actually feel a plant with it, especially now that you see it in the lab, but you can actually feel the texture of the leaf and understand it's got enough calcium and silica in it, because it's just rigid. You know what I mean by that? It's just thick. It has substance to it when you touch it. So what it's actually doing is making everything thicker. And when it's thicker, you get more sunlight captured as well. So silica, we use a lot of silica roughly at V2, either in furrow or V2. If you wanted to track silica in a soil, it makes it really tough because there's a lot of it in the soil. But the availability of silica really isn't tied back to how much is in the soil. It's tied back to how active your biology is. The higher biology in your soil, naturally your plant takes up way more silica. So soil to soil, hard to tell when you're going to get a response other than looking at biology. If your biology is really high, typically you're going to get less of a response to adding silica to a plant as a foliar or an in-furrow treatment.
How should we be trying to stimulate our biology in our soil?
Well, there's a lot of that, right? His question is, how can we try to stimulate our biology within our soil? Well, first of all, again, a healthy plant creates healthy soil, right? There's hands down, no doubt in my mind. These guys that want to go in and say, oh, I'll just cut my fertilizer and I'll have less salts and a healthy plant soil. You don't get healthy soil unless you build carbon, and the best way to build carbon is biomass, root structure, and exudates. That's for sure. So again, there's some simulations as far as sucrose, right? Sugars, cane molasses, those things are definitely a stimulant. What we see all the time in the lab, we'll add these different sources of sugar. Watch the microbes just blow up. Just go from a 30 part per million to even 450 type part per million. What I like people to understand though is them big spikes aren't always good. What we actually want to see is something that brings it, elevates it, but maybe we don't need to elevate it 10x, we want to elevate it 2x, and something that's going to last. And in my opinion, that's where you get into them longer chains of carbon. So again, molasses, humics, fulvics, those things to me is the best way to stimulate because it doesn't give you gas, hit the gas pedal and then hit the brake, hit the gas pedal, hit the brake. It's giving you that nice sustained amount of plant food, so that's what's stimulating. That's my best answer for that. The other thing is, again, anytime you feed a plant anytime you feed the plant something it wants, your Brix levels are going to go up in the plant. If it wants it, Brix levels are going to go up. When Brix levels go up, sugar goes up. When sugar goes up, everything stimulates in that soil at a high level. It's the same reason why, if you think about phosphorus, you've probably seen these studies, but if you apply phosphorus today, 90% of soil, 6 to 8 weeks later, you're not going to get much out of that phosphorus. You get a good release right away, and at the end, you don't. Well, where do we struggle with phosphorus in corn and soybeans is typically when the soils dry out and we start getting hot. Reason why is because the biology slows down, right? So as biology slows down, we get less and less phosphorus into that plant. And what we're noticing now is instead of adding, I seen on the last slide of Stevens, he showed that adding phosphorus in season paid. The reason adding phosphorus in season paid is simply because it's still in the soil, but it's not, there's no microbe activity to break it down and put it in that available form. So what we're actually seeing is adding stimulants is better than adding phosphorus in season, and we're getting more phosphorus release. So using biology and using fulvics and molasses, those three things, we've actually seen sugar growth. Actually, we compared last year where we did 10 gallons of 1034O in a Y drop, 20 gallons of 1034 in a Y drop, compared to biology, fulvic, and humic, and the biology, fulvic, and humic beat it every time. We got more phosphorus into the plant just by adding that to break down and release some of that phosphorus in the soil. So I consider that a great stimulant.
What about timing on adding those and application? So you better do off doing it in furrow,
No.
adding molasses, that kind of spray over the top,
Yeah.
spray Roundup.
Well, we could talk about that too. So first of all, does everybody know the difference in a fulvic, humic, all that? You want to talk about it? Do we have time? Okay, so humates, dry humates, they can be broken down into humics and then fulvics, okay? And within humics, you've got humic substance and you've got humic acids. Humic substance just means it's not been broken down quite as far, and you're going to have the form humin in it, H-U-M-I-N. H-U-M-I-N is important. That's in humus. That's what's in your organic matter, your water track organic carbon. That's important to hold anions, okay? It's the only thing that's going to hold anions in your soil is humin, H-U-M-I-N. That's humic substance. The next step is humic acid. Humic acids are just absolutely amazing at adding, releasing anything with a cation. Potassium will go up, calcium will go up. So if you're adding in-season calcium or potassium, always add humic acid, every time. If I'm adding nitrogen or sulfur, I want humic substance, right? Because it has the humin in it. If I'm just looking for a foliar stimulant, then I want to use fulvic. Now fulvics are very good in furrow as well. I usually try to run a ratio of roughly a 1 to 5 of humic versus fulvic versus my humic. Because they all do different things. They all have different cation exchange capacities, and they chelate differently and they stimulate differently. So the combinations are great, but understanding how to use them is important as well. So again, if I'm looking for a nitrogen additive or sulfur, I don't want to use fulvic, or I don't want to use humic acid, I want to use humic substance, okay? Did I answer that question? Yeah, ask it again. Ask it again, what did I miss?
Well, I'm just curious,
What stage to apply that?
what stage and how, is it better to foliar feed those kind of things, is it better to in-furrow feed those kind of things?
Yeah, depending on the nutrient, right? Well, very seldom will you ever hear me say fall unless it's lime. So there's a lot of ways to feed them. He's asking how do we feed it. On phosphorus, what we were talking about in that particular situation. Again, I personally believe the Y drop, if I'm going to force feed phosphorus, is great. But if I'm actually stimulating, I'm actually doing that a little quicker than that. I'm usually using V8 as a foliar so I can get at all the soil, break down the entire soil. So if I can get these biologies to get across the soils better than in my opinion, when we're looking at solubilization, better than in a band. But back to the better way to answer that is 6 weeks after application of P is when your P that you applied is going to start to be limited. So that's a great indication, and typically that's V8, V9 corn. And if you look at all your tissue tests, that's what you're going to see. You have great phosphorus early, then it's going to crash, and then you hope to bring it back up because at the end of the year it's really important again. But most of the time that doesn't happen, and the reason why it doesn't happen is because again, when that plant doesn't have enough sunlight to both feed the ear enough sugar and the root enough sugar, the first place it's going to go is to try to fill that ear out. Well, as soon as the sugars quit going to the root stops. Once that root stops, there's no nutrition coming in. So that's why, again, I keep talking about that R5, how important it is. The biggest differentiator in big yields versus average yields is that R5 tissue, right? Nutrient density. Well, the reason that's happening is because you have a system that had enough sugar to keep that root moving 3 weeks later into the season to bring that nutrient levels up. So it all ties together if that makes any sense.
What form of sugar is best, fructose or glucose or?
I guess I would go with longer chains of carbon is best. I don't get a lot of response out of straight sugars very often. Like I say, longer chains, meaning back into the fulvics, molasses, humics, those type of things, to me, are more of a sustained availability for the bios. I very seldom use just straight sugar. Yep.
Could you speak to 30 versus 50-inch soybeans?
Could I repeat it?
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think, so I thought Stephen had a good point with what he was saying, but I think instead of paying attention to row spacing, I think what I like to focus on is and I'd say Jimmy would say the exact same thing. It's more or less how many inches do we have before we can create the perfect plant on each side. So if I'm in higher populations, I've got to go to a 15-inch row, and that's why I'm getting that 3 to 5 bushel. It typically isn't all about, I guess I don't necessarily agree that it came back to all sunlight in that scenario. I actually believe it had to do with the amount of volume of root and the structure that I can create in that plant. So again, if I'm in high pop, 15s are going to have a big value over 30s. If I'm in low pop, we very seldom see an advantage to 15s over 30s unless we're in way northern climate. The further north you get, the narrower row spacing pays, both wheat and corn, or wheat and beans. I'll say that our biggest struggle with narrow row beans and corn both is trapping heat in on those years that we don't get cool enough nighttime temps. You know, you can walk in the canopy in the morning and it's cool. You get about 60 rows in and you're hotter than heck already, right? Because you couldn't cool it down. So what we're actually doing is doing tram rows. When we got 20-inch growers, we're putting tram lines in just to let the air cool the canopy. Because it's dang hot on certain years in South Dakota, well, everywhere. But you got to have the nighttime temps to be able to support narrow rows. Narrow rows are great because you get more surface area for every plant, right? But in reality, again, I think you got to think about that with your population to find out if you're going to have a value there. Now, Jimmy's all 30s, he's went 15s, he's went twin 30s, he's done, you know, every row spacing that he can do, he comes back to 30s. He can manage 30s. I'd say Greg, he's showing me that he's basically 3 bushel better in a 15 than a 30. He's in Illinois. So again, they've both been 120, 130 with 30s or 15s. Not a huge difference in percentage-wise. Well, thank you guys.
I got a couple questions from online here. Foliar feeding soybeans. When's the best time, or what's your advice on when to foliar soybeans?
Well, if you miss your first app, again, just like corn, you're developing so much. Our biggest mistake in soybeans is we put all the effort in the R3, R4, R5 time period. Not to say it's not important, but if you don't start early enough, you don't get the big value at the end. So we like to start at V2, V3 is when we're hitting it, and then again R1 and then R4. So there's 3 transitional times in there, and if you think about why we're doing that is, one, we're trying to push more light into the plant early, right? We got small area, we're going to push more light into the plant early. 2, we're trying to create that structure, because if we get extra energy, what happens? The energy goes to the root, sugars go to the root, we create more root, we get more cytos, we get more branching, right? So we're trying to force that to happen. If you don't start early enough, you don't get it. Because all your nodes in that plant's potential is basically determined by V5. So anything we do after V5 is never going to add a node per acre. And again, node per acre is a huge component of yield. Seed size, obviously, and how many seeds we put in the pods, obviously part of it too, right? So then we hit R1, R2, and the reason there is to promote more flowering, you know, obviously, and then to retain the flowers. So we're trying to give it the right nutrition to retain flowers through stress. And then on the back side, the reason we're hitting it is because we're with the fungicide, and again, I don't believe you'll ever maximize a fungicide unless you're maximizing the nutrition, and I don't believe you'll ever maximize the nutrition without maximizing the fungicide, because again, they go together to elongate that period. You want as many days as you can get in R3 and R4 as possible in any crop. It doesn't matter if it's corn, soybeans, wheat. The longer you can keep that crop in that reproduction stage, the bigger yield's going to be, because the bigger the depth of that kernel and the weight you're going to have. The other thing I'll say is, a lot of guys with back into that corn side, I see people that want big girthy ears. You know, if I see an 18 to 20 or 22 around, truthfully, I know I'm screwed. You'll never hit 350 or anything over 300 with that big girthy ear. I've never seen it anyway. So typically, if we even see, this last year we did some starter trials. This one starter trial was unbelievable. The plants were unbelievable. Everything looked so great. You just got so excited. Ultimately ended up yielding less, because in the same genetic platform, it was 18 to 20 around, and where the non-treatment was 14 to 16 around. When you get the 14 to 16s, you can still put enough girth or depth into that kernel late in the year to have a big effect on your divisional factor. So in other words, when you're estimating corn yields, most guys divide by 90,000, right? But the high yield guys are actually, their real division in the field is 50, 55. You know, if you don't maximize it, you can be 110,000. So in other words, I was talking to a Pioneer guy, and he was sharing with me that on 1197, which has been a tremendous hybrid for high yields if it's managed right, the kernel depth had effect by basically double. So in other words, the divisibility was 51,000 all the way up to 120,000. So that's how much of effect you can have on seed size. If you can affect that much seed size, think of what that does for yield, right? So again, pushing that back end hard to try to keep it into that window a longer period of time. Now, the same thing goes to, I'll say this too. If I had to, you could pick any hybrid in the world, let's say, and I was a 105-day area, I would take a product that flowered like a 97 and filled like a 105. Why? Because it's given me reproduction window longer. I want to be in vegetative shorter period of time, reproduction a longer period of time. So genetics does some of that, but then management does the other part of that. So anytime we can keep it in reproduction longer, the better opportunity we have for bigger yields.
Okay, on the humic products that you talked about, any suggested sources or manufacturers that you want to throw out there? I just wondering where to get those.
I probably shouldn't. I work with quite a few companies that offer that. The question was, again, is there any particular companies that have a better humic or fulvic? I would say this, just for everybody that wants to try it, I would have their functional groups tested. Again, it's probably, don't pay too much attention to how active it is. So a lot of people want to, we're used to understanding 4-pound Roundup as your rate, right? That's how active it is, 4-pound Roundup or 5-pound Roundup or 6-pound Roundup. Fulvics, don't look at just the percent of fulvic. Pay attention to where it came from and the process that it was created in. So in other words, Leonardite, is a preferred source. And again, the slower that process, less alkalinity used in that process, actually leaves more of the goodies in that humic or fulvic at the end of the year. So that's what we look for. I don't know I won't say a great source. But.
Talk to us about nitrate versus ammonia for corn specifically.
Okay, so nitrogen is, again, the inorganic forms that we're going to take up are going to be nitrate and ammonia. Nitrate is a negative form. It's going to promote a lot of vegetative growth. So it's the male growth of the plant. It's getting erect and it's going tall, right? The female side is where reproduction takes place, right? And in reality, what we want to do is have more ammonium, because ammonium slows that growth down, but still gives it a protein. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it takes a lot less of that plant's energy to take ammonium and convert it to a protein than it does that of nitrate. So at the end of the year, like I told you earlier, what happens when we don't have enough energy? We shut down roots because all the sugars are going to the ear, right? Well, what else happens at the end of the year? Our biggest demand for a lot of our nutrition, right? So if we're taking up 30, 40, 50 pounds of nitrogen in 2 weeks, we're also losing that energy to that conversion, right? From nitrate to ammonium. So if we can feed it ammonium, we didn't have to waste that energy on that nitrate to ammonium conversion, so we can keep that root alive longer, because we have sugars to feed both sides. So anytime we can help make that plant more efficient with sugars, we're going to win, because again, the higher sucrose production on per acre basis is your highest yield you'll ever produce on a per acre basis. It's all about sucrose production and how much we can save.
So earlier when I shared the pictures of when we were melting AMS and trying to run anhydrous into irrigation water, this is why. Because Jason said, we need ammonium lake, how do we get, everybody's put 20, 32% into irrigation. We dump more and more on, we don't get a yield response. And so we feel like that if we can manipulate that, get that ammonium out there,
Yeah.
we'll have a response.
Great, great. And the other thing, keep in mind, anions are going to compete with anions. So when we've got 100 pounds of nitrate sitting in the soil, and we know we need sulfur in the plant, right? Because sulfur is going to help that conversion we've talked about the entire time. Well, how is it going to bring up the 4 pounds of sulfur there when I've got 100 pounds of nitrate sitting in? So again, they're going to compete or battle at that uptake side. So if I can put ammonium with sulfur, the sulfur is going to go up into the plant at a much faster pace and more effective pace than if there would have been nitrate and sulfate together.
What about nitrogen stabilizers? Any that you recommend or thoughts on nitrogen stabilizers?
Yeah, I think they all got their place, right? I guess if you're worried about, it depends on what you're worried about. If you're worried about losing to the atmosphere or worried about leaching, determines that. But I'll say this, I'll give you a better, or a natural way. A natural way is just to have the formulation right. It takes 100 parts carbon, it takes to every 10 parts of nitrate. And then for every 10 parts of nitrate, it takes 1 pound of sulfur. For every 1 pound of sulfur, it takes 0.5 parts per million moly, okay? So when you put that together, what you're doing is building a complete protein, and a complete protein is stable in your soil. So again, remember I showed you SLAN on our soil test? That's what we're measuring, is the protein side of the end. What we really need to be doing is thinking, how do we convert our nitrogen into protein? Because it's stable, it's there year after year after year, it spoon feeds the crop. We can actually increase SLAN when we have enough available carbon to match our nitrogen amounts that are applied. Well, it's impossible to do that at 240 to 300 pounds per acre of nitrogen applied at one shot. When we start spoon feeding, we can do a better job of encapsulating and protecting that nitrogen from both leaching and volatilization. And again, it's a direct food source. So I think the future of farming is going to be carbon-based fertility in biology. I really do. We got to soften this fertility, and how you soften it is put enough carbon around it to protect it, right? To chelate it, basically. So again, carbon-based fertility, I think, is the future. Humates, humics allow us to do that with inorganic nutrient sources. We're basically creating a manure source, right? In a sense, that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do.
Thoughts on bicarbonate. So talking about cations and anions from an irrigation standpoint, what do we need to be thinking about in this whole equation as we're putting bicarbonates in there?
My thoughts are it's going to be hardest on your cations. So it's going to be way harder on cations than it is going to be your anions. So in other words, what I'm saying is, if I'm going to apply anything fertigation-wise, I would stay away from all cations in those solutions, because I don't think you're going to get anything out of it. For every part per million carbonate, you're basically going to tie up a pound of calcium. So if you've got 700 part per million bicarbonate in your soil, or your water, sorry, it doesn't do us any good to put a gallon of calcium through there, right? Because it's going to disappear. And I actually think, though, I think there's an opportunity there yet. Once we build up carbonates around the dripper, I think that there's a potential there that we can actually put enough fulvics in there to soften that and chelate that out, okay? So again, humates, where my biggest value has always been, is on poor water quality overhead pivots. And the reason why is because when I apply the humates, as they break down and dissolve, they're chelating a lot of the antagonistic nutrients, so they're allowing some of our better nutrients to get into the plant. So I think we have a lot of opportunity there with the strip tape as well, of forcing some of that through that, folics to tie up some of the things that we're doing.
Any other questions here? We'll let Jason go before we ruin his voice all the way.
Thank
All right,
you.
Thank you, Jason.